Here is the second presentation of the Obscure History School, and it's called The First Immigration Restriction, the Page Act of 1875. And we'll just discuss the background, its implications of like the rise of anti-Asian sentiments, a lot of stereotypes that still exist today. We'll talk about what the government intervened and how they intervened, and then we'll talk about why the US did this and the impact that it still has today. Like what influence does it have on modern day America? So the introduction. So first off, I just want everyone to just like think of maybe one example of media, like shows or movies where Asians have been portrayed in like a stereotypical way. So like that could be like the parent being a tiger mom, or it could be like the kid being like, I don't know, like made portrayed to be very like nerdy or like smart.
I have two that like immediately popped into my head, and it's neither of those, but they're st very stereotypical.
Yeah. I could probably share first, but like one of the main ones I can always think of is always on Disney Channel. I know that Disney Channel was for kids, but I feel like Disney Channel fell into like every like stereotype trap that like you can fall into. Like a lot of their Asian characters were always made to be like stressed about school. Like they were the smart ones. Like they always knew everything. Like in Jesse, like with Ravi, I feel like they just like kind of fell into like the pitfall of making him a very like stereotypical like nerdy Asian. And like when they went to camp, he was like the one person that they made unathletic, which like I feel
Oh,
like is like a very like a very odd detail to add in. Like his like white like football brother was like of course like super athletic, well, but like then he like couldn't catch a ball.
that's terrible. Maeve, can you think of one?
I can't quite remember the title. I've been trying to search it up, but I remember there was this one movie I watched at my friend's birthday party where it was like it was like a trio of friends finding treasure, and one of the friends was Japanese, and he was like he had to be the smartest one. He was like nerdy and wore glasses, and he was like yeah, it was just very stereotypical, and he but yeah, I can't think of the name.
I don't know if I know that movie, but yeah, that's really stereotypical of the model minority myth. The one that came to my head immediately was Men in Black 2. I don't know if you guys know that movie, Men in Black. It's with Will Smith and um basically there's a scene where they go into a Chinese restaurant and the Chinese restaurant owner happens to be an alien and they're like punching him in the face. It's like so violent and they're doing it in like a goofy way, like to make it like funny, but because the Chinese chef is like an alien, right? But they're like uh charging this chef for cooking exotic alien meat, which is like so stereotypical of like the idea that like, Asians like eat like foods that are not um mainstream or like not regulated, so I thought of that, and another one that immediately came to mind was Charlie's Angels, the new one, with Lucy Liu. And she's one of the angels, and she's like totally portrayed in that role as like kind of like a sexualized, like person in the way that Asian women are stereotypically like portrayed as like they're sexualized in that way.
Yeah, that's like those are really good points. And I feel like the topic of like Asians like eating like exotic or like not mainstream things, I could talk about forever because like it's like I know that like a lot of these things may not be like what you like expect like a meal to a traditional like meal to me. But like it always frustrates me a lot because like a lot of these meals were like made like so that like no part of the animal went to waste. Like if you think about it, like US, like consumerism, we have a problem with overconsumption because we don't even use everything that we like kill animals for. Like chicken, the chicken feet, the beaks, like all those parts, they're all just discarded. Maybe they're like thrown into dog food if we're lucky, but like a lot of the times they're just like trashed. Or if you think about like cows, like their inner organs, like no one in like the US like uses them. So it's just like they get thrown out. But like a lot of like Asian cultures, they use these parts because they didn't want any part of the animal to go to waste. Or it's like, like during times of poverty, when you only have one cow, you want to find ways to make every part taste good and you want to find ways to use every part. It's like it always frustrated me when people call it disgusting because it's like a lot of these were rooted in like just trying to survive and not be wasteful. And like if we practice like a lot of these like or like if people like tried these dishes or tried ways of making use of like not mainstream like animal parts, we could probably fix more problems like overconsumption or like just like taking too much. Like I don't know. I feel like that topic is just so like dense and there's like so much to say about it because like it always frustrates me when people like say certain things. Like I was in a class once and like my global teacher was like chicken feet are a delicacy in a lot of parts of the world. And like they are. Like I know in like Chinese culture they're a delicacy. Like people eat them. They're like there's a lot of dishes surrounding chicken feet. And then like everyone on my table was like, "Oh, like that's disgusting."
Mhm.
Like their first like reaction and it just like frustrated me because like it's like these dishes were created, they could have been created during a time of poverty and they were created so that nothing went to waste. So it's just like I don't know. I just feel like it's so rude to say something about it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anyways, so here are some examples that I pulled. So the first one is one of a very famous movie and it's pretty much where there's a white man who's a white savior and there's this Asian woman, she's shy, she's submissive, she's described to be childlike and pretty much though there's a white savior who has to come and save her and guide her to safety. And it's a very stereotypical way to depict Asian women because Asian women are made to be submissive, they're made to be over sexualized, and here they're made to be childlike, docile, and submissive. So like we see a lot of these stereotypes persist to the modern day, but we can also see how they kind of just like stemmed from a lot of these like older media. Like media is a very strong like medium to like perpetrate stereotypes. And like they do it in ways that are subtle that you may not even recognize it, which is why it's so harmful. Because now like you have this image stuck in your head of what Asian women are like and you don't even realize it's been stuck there. The second example with it's the storyline is that a Japanese bride is pretty much getting wed off to a white man again. And she's described, quote unquote, delicate and graceful figure, which seems strangely fantastic. And the darkness that envelopes us conceals the fact that her face is quite ugly and almost without eyes. So, just from that, like one line, obviously, we see a lot of the modern stereotypes arise where like Asians are said to have small eyes or like Asians aren't said to be like the beauty standard of America. And like we can kind of see all of these stereotypes stem from like older medias. And like so now we know that these stereotypes persisted for a long time because anti-Asian sentiments have persisted for a very long time. And then for a more modern day example and a more like subtle example in Mean Girls, these underage girls are sexually assaulted by a coach and it's like kind of played for laughs as like these two girls fight over him. And already like the whole scene is very strange because why would you depict teenage girls getting with a coach or an older figure? But like it's even worse that like as I've talked about with like the over sexualization of Asians, how like it's like two Asian characters that have to do this. Because like I
Mhm.
said, Asians are depicted as childlike, shy, submissive, and here we kind of see that it manifests in modern day television and media. So, just for another quick talk, what impact do you think these portrayals have on the Asian community, and how do you think it affects people who are watching it? Like maybe people who aren't as educated, or like they're just like watching it and they're not really like understanding like what the media is like saying.
Well, I can just say that like me experiencing like My youth growing up in New York City as an Asian female in a space where there wasn't a lot of Asian females, like, it was crazy how often I was sexualized growing up, and I also went to Catholic school, so I had a Catholic school uniform on. So because I had a Catholic school uniform on with a skirt and I was an Asian female, like, I was sexualized, like, so freaking often that it was like it was almost like I got desensitized by it by the time I was, like, in high school, and even, when I was, like, a young adult, like, guys would grab my butt on the subway, and it didn't even affect me. I would just, like, be able to tell the guy, like, "Literally not in the mood today, like, can you move your hand?" You know, like but it was so frequent as even as a young child.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's like also one of the things, like a lot of like subtle like microaggressions or like discrimination, it's like something that people are so used to that like it's kind of just like, oh, like this is like what happens, like yeah, like desensitivity. And I think that that also leads to indifference. And I know that there's like a lot of people who talk about how indifference is the greatest enemy of like humanity, because like once you're indifferent about something, it's very hard to press for change. So I think like that's why it's important right now that we're like educating and advocating about it so that people know this isn't what it's supposed to be like. This is like the wrong life. And yeah, and I talked a lot about how like in like older media, it was less subtle. Like it was more just like macroaggression. Like it was like just like pure, like you could see the racism. But like in modern media, it's a lot more subtle, or it's a lot more just like woven in the stereotypes and the microaggressions. So like people, like I said, who aren't like paying attention or who may not be that aware that these stereotypes exist may walk away thinking, well, this is the real thing. Like
Yeah,
this is how they act. And I think that's more dangerous than macroaggression, because macroaggressions are a lot easier to like recognize. Like you can like more people can like see like, oh, like that's obviously not true. This is obviously discriminatory. But with microaggressions, especially in modern day media, and a lot of it's found in like children TV shows, I think it's a lot more like dangerous because like now it's woven into kids from a very young age, and it's
mhm.
very hard to like change that perspective. Like when oh, I think almost like every show I watched growing up had to have like some sort of like stereotypical like person of color in their like media. And like now obviously I know those stereotypes are wrong, but when I was watching it, it was kind of like, oh well, this is like how the group actually is. It was like this whole like generalization.
Yeah,
So I
and you believe it. You believe
yeah.
it to be true, so you have to unlearn that, and
Yeah.
that's what's crazy.
Yeah, that's like what makes it really hard because like since they're so subtle, your brain doesn't even realize that it's made this like generalization. Like you only realize it once you like interact with like actual people and you see, well, like those stereotypes were obviously very incorrect.
Yeah, but so just to show you how, it affects your life, even my most recent boss, when he hired me, he must have assumed that because I was Asian, I would just be like this obedient worker bee. And there was a point where he even asked me because he realized I'm not a stereotypical Asian woman, right? I'm an American, like so he asked me like, "Do you identify as Korean or as an American?" And I was like, well, I was born and raised here. So what do you think? Like, do you identify as Italian or American?" Like like, it was just he would never ask that, right, if I was white, but he asked me that because he had an idea of who I would be, and I wasn't fulfilling his expectations.
Yeah. So I think overall it's just very hard to like unlearn these stereotypes because they're very ingrained in society in very subtle and like obvious ways. So like I think that right now in order to unlearn them we just have to educate ourselves because and like work to like make change or like work to like make sure that like TV shows that are being produced now don't have these same stereotypes that they had when they were produced in the 2000s. So here is just the historical background for today's discussion. So immigrants were arriving in America. a lot of them arrived in the 1850s because this was known as Golden America. If you hear a lot of quotes about like America being paved with gold, a lot of these probably stemmed from Golden America era because this was the time of the gold rush where people were flooding California and the western coast to find gold and wealth. And there were a lot of misleading labor contracts that were created with Asian immigrants. So what would happen is people that worked for railroad companies or other like labor jobs would go to Asian countries and create contracts with Asians living there. And they would pretty much just be like, if you come with me to America, you'll have good hours, you'll have good wages, you'll make a lot of money that you can send back to your families. And then once the Asians actually got there and immigrated, they'd find that really a lot of these contracts were made with lies. So in the homeland, China was actually raging with the Opium War, and there was a lot of poverty. So a lot of people actually wanted to immigrate. And when you combine this with like the misleading labor contracts, America seems like the perfect place to go, right? It was promising economic wealth, like liberty and freedom. But when they actually came here, they found that it was completely the opposite of what they imagined. So a lot of immigrants ended up working on the Transcontinental Railroad, or the railroad that connects the east and west of the United States. And they worked crazy hours. It was very cruel. It was very cheap labor. It was exploitation. They were given almost no money. They had very little wealth to send back to their families or for themselves. And this was because Asian immigrants were seen as inferior to white workers. So it's like, well, they're not really like people that we have to protect, so there's no point in doing it. And the government let the exploitation run free because they wanted to make as much money as possible and spend as much as possible on the railroad. And because of this, there were a lot of unsafe working conditions, as we'll talk about later. And like no politicians ever really cared, and no reforms were passed to protect these immigrants. And a lot of people during this time of Golden America really liked having immigrants here because it's like, hey, we have good jobs. We're all wealthy. We don't want to work these like low laborious jobs. Like let the inferior immigrants work them. However, this perspective of immigrants being helpful to America began to decline once the economy began to decline. And what happened was Asians became threats and there was this huge rise of anti-Asian sentiments in the United States. And what happened was because of the fact that people were now like their own economy and economic wealth was declining and they wanted the jobs that the immigrants were working. Well, now all of a sudden, everything that had been going on unchecked became unacceptable. So in addition to this, white immigrants like the German and Irish arrived to America, and yet only Asians were seen as threats because America, in order to be pure, just had to be white. So since German and Irish immigrants were white, they could technically stay. And a lot of religions actually opposed Asian immigrants, and there were this huge increase of stereotypes that Asians were diseased and carried a lot of illnesses, that they don't shower, they're unclean, they're unhygienic. And surprisingly enough, these stereotypes that Asians are dirty have obviously carried into the modern day world. When we think about the COVID-19 pandemic and this idea that Asians always carry diseases, that Asians eat like dirty, exotic foods, we can still see them today. This huge influx of anti-Asian sentiments that occurred during COVID-19, all of the Asian violence, we can see all of these stereotypes that were rooted so far ago are still exist today, and they're still just as strong as today. And they resurface every time there's even a little bit of vulnerability or anything that they can latch onto that can hurt the minority, they do. And that's, I think, the most like disheartening thing, that these stereotypes keep popping up throughout history. And I think the biggest threat during this time period was that a lot of immigrants were beginning to settle down, or they were beginning to build families and like homes in America. Like I said before, America, to be pure, had to be white. So if they really were settling down, that means America was no longer pure in the eyes of a lot of Americans. So these immigrants were viewed as growing threats. And like I said before, because the economy was declining, now all of a sudden they were stealing jobs. even though they were being exploited. So women made a huge part in anti-Asian sentiments. We talked before about how women were over-sexualized, painted as submissive, shy, docile, and we kind of see that stem here. Women, or like immigrants, they were seen as sexual threats. They were painted to all be prostitutes. Like it was this generalization that all Asian women were prostitutes coming to America purely to sin, even though most of them or many of them actually worked jobs as cooks, household like workers, etc. So we could see that these stereotypes were incorrect, but they were still being perpetuated everywhere. Chinese women were accused of being the primary transmitters of STIs and STDs. And like I said before, while Asians were seen as being unhygienic and unclean. So now they kind of pin that specifically on women, saying that they carried STIs and STDs. Even though both white and Asian women worked in the sex industry, we can always see this like isolation of the minority and like scapegoating. Whatever issue they have, they're going to pin on the minority. And the most like disheartening part about all of this is that a lot of Chinese women were actually kidnapped. There were smugglers that were going to kidnap these Chinese women and remove them from their home country to force them to become sex workers. So like all of these stereotypes of Chinese women being over sexualized creatures, shy, submissive, docile, a lot of it stemmed from the fact that these women were being kidnapped and forced to work in the sex industry. And it's like all this like big loop and cycle that's really hard to break. So, I mean, I've talked about it already, but does anyone else have any examples of how they've seen these stereotypes in recent COVID-19 pandemics or other examples? Because I'm sure there's a lot.
Well, for sure with COVID, I mean, like, which was kind of ridiculous, like that, like it was to the point where I remember hearing parents telling kids not to go near Asian American kids because it doesn't even make any sense, right? Like, don't go near Asian American kids in school because what, right? Like, that's not even how viruses spread. It's just so, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's like during times of like panic or like confusion, it's like people forget like basic like science or like biology. And it's just like it's like they acted like all Asians inherently just like had this disease. Like we were all just like carrying it just because we were Asian. And like I just remember it was always really awkward in school. Like every time the COVID-19 pandemic was brought up, like before schools in America shut down, when there was that period where it was like spreading throughout like China and like Asia, it was always very awkward when it was brought up because it always felt like every kid was like looking at the Asian kid.
Yeah. Which is, again, like just not the way viruses spread. Like,
But like like this also reminds me of like during like World War II when they were like locking up Japanese Americans because they were like, oh well, they like could be spies, even though most of them hadn't even gone back to Japan in their whole lives. Like they had just spent their whole lives in America and they never gone to Japan. And it just kind of reminded me of that because like when the COVID-19 pandemic was happening, I hadn't gone to China for like years. Like if there was some sort of disease that was coming out, how could I possibly have been like, how could I possibly have it? And it's just like, I feel like it kind of just goes back to like scapegoating and just like you want to pin the blame on whoever you can.
yeah. But I feel like it really does have a deep psychological impact on the Asian American community here, because even if like so many of us like have not even been to Asia, but like because of like the sentiments that are targeted towards us, like it makes like I feel like I overcompensate sometimes, like when I'm like hanging out with like certain other friends, like non-Asian friends, like I have to like say things like, oh, this is sterilized, like, oh, this is like just been washed, um like
And
I find myself doing that.
I think the biggest thing about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it kind of rewired that like Asians are foreigners or like perpetual foreigners.
Totally.
I think that's like the biggest thing because like after the COVID-19 pandemic, I feel like it just kind of like redrew the line between like what people consider to be Americans and then like and like drew a line down with like Asians, even though a lot of them were Asians Americans who had been born in America.
Yeah, totally.
So as we talked about, a lot of these negative stereotypes arose, threats, perpetual foreigners, and just being objects in general inferior. And this inequality and discrimination that was experienced back then still still influences millions of people today, and millions of people are still being influenced. So now I'm going to talk about what the government decided to do and how they decided to react. So one of the biggest breaking points for this first restrictive immigration act was the fact that Chinese women were threatening the institution of marriage. Men were supporting and frequenting prostitution rings, and they were never punished, but it was blamed on the Chinese woman for breaking up Christian families by tempting the men with sex. And there was a representative, his name was Horace Page, and he was very known for his anti-Chinese, anti-Asian sentiments and his like political view, and he wanted to rid of the immoral Chinese woman. So like this idea that they were breaking good Christian families and like the institution of marriage was like this huge stepping stone for like the next steps. And it led to the Page Act of 1875. So this was one of the first most restrictive immigration acts to be passed, and it was designed so that undesirable immigrants wouldn't be able to enter the United States. And like the thing was, there was no like strict like outline that they had to follow. It just relied on court judges, law enforcement, and court officers to decide whether or not a woman was a prostitute. And I mean, how do you decide that? Like you just look at them and you just decide, oh yeah, this person's like a prostitute or a sex worker. Like obviously it's very subjective and there was no true measurement. So it's pretty much just like you could reject any Asian woman that you wanted. Like there was no like real way to tell whether or not someone was going to be a prostitute. And so they were just targeting Asian women. And the bill itself stated that any immigrants who were brought for lewd and immoral purposes were to be banned. But again, how do you measure that? So really this just gave the power to the port officers and law enforcement that they could ban whoever they wanted. So this is some more context about Angel Island. So it had a 30-year existence from 1910 to 1940, and it closed because a fire broke out. And Angel Island processed about 500,000 immigrants from 80 different countries. So a lot of Asian immigrants immigrated through Angel Island because of its location. And its main goal was to allow for greater control over immigration, prevent immigrations on the island from communicating with immigrations on the mainland, and slow the introduction of new or deadly diseases to the general population. So these are its goals. And remember, a lot of Asian immigrants came through Angel Island. And what we see is that because port officers now had the ability to just like turn away anyone and just like for like immoral purposes, then you can see a lot of like humiliation or a lot of like exploitation and abuse of Asian women by these immigration officers because they were treated very unfairly. There's a lot of poems that are scratched into the walls. So you can imagine how like anger, how much suffering they've been through to scratch a poem into the walls of like the treatment that they had to endure, the abuse they had to endure, and they pretty much just banned anyone convicted of a crime in their homeland. So this act, the Page Act, also authorized the use of federal agents at any immigration port to search and question any subject of an Oriental country. So some people had to resort to bribes to get in because they weren't being let in fairly. One poem that was scratched into the wall reads, "With 100 kinds of oppressive laws, they mistreat us Chinese. It is still not enough after being interrogated and investigated several times. We also have to have our chests examined while naked." So obviously we see that there was a lot of inequality, there's a lot of unfairness, there's a lot of abuse that was going towards Asian immigrants who are walking through. They had to be interrogated, investigated. The Page Act, a very oppressive and targeted act. And the words, "we also have to have our chests examined while naked," was pretty much shown that they were given nothing to themselves. Everything that they had was allowed to be examined because, remember, as long as they were brought in for immoral purposes, they could be turned away. And here is another poem. "Imprisoned in the wooden building day after day, my freedom withheld, how can I bear to talk about it? I look to see who is happy, but they only sit quietly. I'm anxious and depressed and cannot fall asleep. The days are long and the bottle constantly empty. My sad mood, even so, is not dispelled. Nights are long and the pillow cold. Who can pity my loneliness? After experiencing such loneliness and sorrow, why not just return home and learn to plow the fields? America, this place that was made to be like this, like huge place of economic wealth, of endless opportunities, of golden roads, and like yet they were treating immigrants with such cruelty and like such like they were completely humiliating and abusing them. A lot of these immigrants had to wait there for weeks in a cold building hoping that they could pass through. And like and it just goes to show how like heavy like racism and discrimination played a role in targeting like Asians as a minority, and how much more difficult it was for Asians, even though there were German and Irish immigrants who were going through without any trouble. And this is another poem, and it continues to like really like push for the fact that like a lot of these immigrants were being exploited by the immigration officers. Upon arriving in America, was arrested. Lim, upon arriving in America, was arrested, put in the wooden building, and made a prisoner. I've already been here for 1 autumn. The Americans refused me admission. I was ordered to be deported. When the news was told, I was frightened and troubled about returning to my home, to my country. We Chinese of a weak nation could only sigh at the lack of freedom. So once again, we see like these people were waiting here for what, a whole season? And they couldn't even be let in. And there was a lot of abuse and exploitation that was going on. So we can just have a quick discussion on how did reading the poems make you feel? And how do you react to learning about America's past and its treatment of minorities? Because a lot of this isn't discussed in school curriculums, even though immigration is like a huge topic.
I feel like reading those poems was so sad because it's like how could America, the supposed like land of opportunity, like treat such a significant amount of people this way?
Yeah. And I just think it's like a very like it's like a double-edged sword, because America loved immigrants when they needed like cheap, free, exploitative labor. But like the moment that it doesn't suit their like exact need anymore, well, now it's like, well, now we have to get rid of them. So,
I just want to add one thing that I think it's also ridiculous because this land is not even theirs. It belongs to the indigenous people. And they literally committed genocide and like murdered millions of indigenous people to claim this land. And
yeah,
then to say that you're not allowed on this land that we stole from indigenous people is, I think, ridiculous. It's not even your land.
yeah. So this impact, there were a lot of people who were exiled or unable to immigrate into America. And soon, most Asian immigrants in America became males. There were only 48 Chinese women for every 1,000 Chinese men after the Page Act. So why did the US act this way? What was the point of this act and why was it created? Well, as I said before, their biggest concern was that Asians were settling into America. They were setting down roots because America's goal was to have cheap free labor and a pure white America. So they didn't want any immigrants to set roots and start families. And they even tried to separate many families that were already settled because they didn't want Asians in America. They just wanted them to come for free labor and then go back to their homeland. So there were a lot of bachelor males, Chinese bachelor males specifically, because now they had just deported or gotten rid of a lot of Chinese women, and they were seen as driftless and suspicious. Even married ones and their families were subject to very harsh treatment. And I think the biggest, like really most disheartening fact is that a lot of coastal states proceeded to then ban interracial marriage by the 1800s. So they were pretty much like, it was pretty much explicitly saying they didn't want immigrants in America and they wanted them to go home and settle their roots somewhere else. Because like they like banning interracial marriage. You're not even gonna let like Asian women in, but you're not gonna let the Asian men find like other families. So like they were pretty much giving them no options. They had no options left. It was either leave America or you would just be here as a suspicious and driftless bachelor male. So this stigma that the Page Act has created has stuck with our society since. It wasn't repealed until 1974. That's almost a century, almost 100 years that this Page Act was put into place. And as we see in modern day, when I talked about like previous examples, there are a lot of more like really disheartening and sad examples of where we see these stereotypes persist of Asian women being prostitutes or over sexualized. A few years ago, the Atlanta shooting where 6 Asian women were murdered because they were said to be too sexual and like I think it was tempting somebody to sin, kind of illustrates that this influence of these stereotypes are still here and that unfortunately they haven't gone away. So the next steps obviously would be, how do we fight back against these stereotypes and stigmas, and what should we do as an individual, as a society? Well, I think just like by being here or just like willing to like educate yourself and advocate, like that's already one of the big steps. So a lot of people aren't even aware that the Page Act existed or about the history and president in the United States. It's often skipped in school curriculums, but if we educate ourselves and we see how these stereotypes were created and how these social stigmas were created, then it helps fight back against them today. So I just want to thank you for coming to the second presentation of the Obscure History School, and thank you.